Good evening and welcome to our channel. A few years ago, our friend Mark was on his way home from work. He was very excited because it was Friday night and he was going to stop at the local pub for a couple drinks and maybe a dance with a pretty girl. Mark worked 4 to midnight second shift. He got off work and was heading down Old Spring Road when he passed the Spring Hill Cemetery on his right. His headlights caught what he thought was the image of a girl standing behind the gates of the cemetery. He went down to the next corner and made a right to go around the block just to make sure of what he saw. As he passed the cemetery again, he was sure that there was a young girl standing there. Mark pulled over, rolled down his window, and said, "Excuse me, ma'am, are you okay? Do you need a lift somewhere?" The girl bent down and looked at Mark through the passenger side window, nodded her head. "Stow your suitcase in the back," Mark said, "and jump on in." The girl got in the car. Mark couldn't help but notice how beautiful she was. "Can I take you somewhere?" The girl nodded and said nervously, "Home. I just want to go home again." "Okay. Where's home?" "Just drive, and I'll tell you where to turn." "Okay. My name's Mark." "Charlotte. I'm Charlotte." Mark looked over at her and mustered up enough courage to say, "It's Friday night. I usually stop at the local pub for a drink and maybe a dance or two. Would you like to come along? You look like you could use a drink." The girl nodded. Mark pulled up in front of the pub. They got out of the car and went in. They found a table in the corner. Mark ordered a few drinks. They sat in silence and sipped their drinks. At one point, Mark looked over and said, "I've got a couple dollars in my pocket. I could put them in the jukebox." "Okay." Mark went over and found a nice ballad, put his money in, and chose A7. He asked her if she'd like to dance. She got up and they made their way to the middle of the dance floor. As they finished their dance, Charlotte looked up at Mark and said, "It's getting pretty late. I guess I better get home. My mom will be worried." Mark nodded and said, "Okay, let's get out of here." He threw some money on the bar and said, "See you next Friday, Charlie." They jumped in the car and Charlotte said, "Go on up here a couple blocks and make a right. Go up the hill, make another right, and pull over." And they pulled up in front of a big old house on the corner. Charlotte said, "Okay, well, thank you for the ride and the drink and the dance. I gotta go now." She jumped out of the car and Mark waited for her to get into the house safely. When she got up to the top of the rickety old stairs to the porch, she turned and looked over her shoulder and waved and nodded. Mark waved and nodded back and took off. When Mark got home, he jumped into bed, his head spinning from the events of the evening. Charlotte, she was so beautiful. He couldn't get her out of his mind. He laid awake until the sun came through the windows of his bedroom. He heard his mom down in the kitchen and could smell the bacon. Mark jumped out of bed, threw some cold water on his face, and stumbled down the stairs. Go on and sit down, boy. Your breakfast's almost ready, his mother said. Mark sat down at the kitchen table, and his mother spooned some eggs out of the old cast iron fry pan, gave him some bacon, and said, Go on, drink your orange juice and your coffee. Mark gulped down the coffee and started to shovel the food in his mouth. Slow down, boy, you're going to choke. I got something to do today, Mama. I got to run out for a bit. What do you mean you got something to do today? It's Saturday. We got housework. I know, Ma. I'll be right back, I swear. All right, but make sure you are. Mark scooped the rest of the eggs into his mouth and grabbed the bacon on the run, jumped in his car and took off. He hoped that he could remember where the turn was from last night. As luck would have it, the first turn he made went up the hill to the corner where the old house stood. Mark pulled up in front of the house and got out of the car. It looked more decrepit than it did the night before. In fact, it almost looked like nobody even lived there. Mark climbed the crickety old steps up onto the porch and knocked on the door. After a few seconds, he heard footsteps, and the door creaked open. There was an old lady on the other side of the door. Excuse me, ma'am, Mark said. I don't mean to bother you so early on a Saturday morning, but I was wondering if I could talk to Charlotte. The old woman looked at him with a blank stare. What's your name, boy? Mark. My name's Mark. I think you best come in, she said. Mark followed her into the house and down the little hallway into the living room. On the coffee table was a silver tray of sugar cookies, 2 cups, and a steaming pot of coffee. It was almost like the old woman had expected him. Sit down, the old woman motioned to the sofa. Mark sat. The old lady poured the cups of coffee, handed Mark his, and sat down on the chair opposite the couch. So, you say you met my daughter last night? Mark sipped his coffee and nodded. Yes, Charlotte. The old lady reached into her pocket and pulled out a silver flask. She reached over and started pouring some of the contents into Mark's coffee. It's a little early for whiskey for me, ma'am. Mark smelled the alcohol. Son, you're going to need something stronger than that black coffee. The old lady poured some in her cup, put the flask away, and sat back on her chair. It was about 30 years ago, the old woman said. Charlotte had been seeing a young man named Ricky over the summer. Ricky was a troublemaker and not unknown to the police around Spring Hill. When I found out that Charlotte was seeing Ricky, I forbade it. I told her she had to call him and tell him she could never see him again. Tearfully, Charlotte went upstairs, not wanting to disobey her mother, and called the young man. Ricky became furious and said, Your mama can't stop me from seeing you. Here's what we're going to do. Pack up a little suitcase, grab all the money you can find in the house, and whatever jewelry that you think is worth anything, and meet me at Spring Hill Cemetery at midnight. Charlotte did what Ricky asked her to do. She packed some clothes in a suitcase. She knew where all the hiding places her parents had for money. And she dumped her mother's jewelry box into the suitcase and snuck out of the house. She crossed town and up the hill to Spring Hill Cemetery, where she waited for Ricky. When he got there, Ricky said to Charlotte, "I've got a car stashed on the other side of the cemetery. I didn't want anybody to see the car that we were using to get out of town." They walked briskly to the other end of the cemetery, and Ricky demanded, "Give me the suitcase." Charlotte held it close to her and said, "What do you want this for?" Ricky said, "Charlotte, just give me the suitcase, the money, and the jewelry. I'm getting out of this chicken shit one horse town." "But I thought I was going with you. I thought we were running away. I thought we were getting married." Ricky just looked at her and said, "Little girl, give me the suitcase and go on home to your mama." The cemetery groundskeeper found the body the next morning under a big old tree. She had been stabbed multiple times and her throat cut. No signs of a suitcase or Ricky. Mark stared at the old woman. What was she saying? This couldn't possibly be true. "My head's spinning. I think I'm going to be sick. I better go." He got up and raced out of the house and onto the porch. Mark stopped on the porch and thought, "Wait a minute. Is she talking about the same Charlotte?" "Hello, ma'am. It's Mark. I just want to ask you a question." He walked down the hallway and into the living room. The room that he had just been in was empty. No old woman, no sugar cookies, and no furniture. In fact, it looked like the house had been abandoned for the last 30 years. Mark now resides at the hospital for the mentally insane. Is it fiction or is it stranger than fiction? You be the judge. Good night.